The mud in the yard of the Blackwood Saloon was freezing solid, turning into jagged ridges that cut through the thin soles of Beatrice Lowe's morning shoes. She was kneeling on a wooden crate serving as a makeshift auction block, the cold wind whipping her dark hair across her hollowed cheeks. Her black dress, already torn at the right shoulder from where she had been dragged out of her home, offered no protection against the biting November chill. But the cold was nothing compared to the shame. $40, the voice of Elias Lowe, her late husband's brother, rang out over the jeering crowd of miners and drifters. $40 covers the debt she owes me for the burial, and she's yours to work it off. She's quiet, she's obedient, and she doesn't eat much. Laughter echoed in the freezing air. A few men stepped closer, their eyes raking over her shivering form with casual cruelty. Bea bit her bottom lip so hard she tasted copper. She would not cry. She had promised herself she would not give Elias the satisfaction of her tears. She kept her head bowed, staring at the freezing mud, her wrists bound tightly together with rough hemp rope that had already rubbed the skin raw and bleeding. Hidden beneath the torn collar of her dress, a tarnished silver locket pressed against her collarbone like a block of ice. It was the only thing she had left in the world. 45, drawled Silas, a local saloon owner known for buying desperate women and breaking them into cheap labor for his back rooms. He stepped up, chewing on a matchstick, his boots sinking into the muck. She looks a bit starved, Elias, but I can put some flesh back on those bones. Bea squeezed her eyes shut. Her chest hitched in a silent, violent panic. She was 26 years old, a widow of 3 months, and she was being traded like a broken plow horse. The town watched. The sheriff stood on the porch of his office down the street, drinking coffee and looking the other way. There was no law here for a woman without money or a man to claim her. Going to Silas for 45, Elias said, a greedy smile cracking his thin face. Any other? The heavy thud of leather hitting wood silenced the yard. It was a sound so loud, so violently final, that the jeering crowd instantly went still. Elias blinked, looking down at the wooden crate right next to Bea's knee. A large, worn leather pouch sat there. The tie had loosened, spilling a heavy mound of pure gold dust onto the muddy wood. It was easily worth $300, maybe more. Bea flinched, pulling her bound hands against her chest and slowly looked up. A man stood beside the block. He had not walked through the crowd. The crowd had instinctively parted for him. He was massive, his shoulders broad and thick, clad in a weathered, fringed buckskin jacket that smelled of pine sap, wood smoke, and cold wilderness. His dark blonde hair was shaggy, falling over the collar of his coat, and his face looked as though it had been carved from the mountain rock itself, weather-beaten, rough, and entirely unbothered by the men around him. But it was his eyes that made Bea hold her breath. They were a piercing, glacial blue, and they were fixed entirely on Elias Lowe with a quiet, terrifying intensity. Nervous. What? Elias swallowed hard, staring at the gold, then at the giant of a man. What is this? The price, the man said. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, gravelly rumble like stones shifting before a landslide. Silas, the saloon owner, stepped forward, his face flushing red with sudden anger, shouting, "Now hold on a minute, mountain man. We're doing legal business here. You don't just walk in and—" The man didn't look at Silas. He didn't even acknowledge the saloon owner existed. Without a word, he reached to his belt, drew a heavy, bone-handled hunting knife, and stepped onto the block. Bea gasped and shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Fearful, she squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blade to strike her. Instead, she felt a sudden, sharp pull on her wrists. The tight, burning pressure vanished. She opened her eyes. The thick hemp rope fell away into the mud, sliced cleanly in two. The man slid the knife back into its sheath with a smooth, practiced motion. He looked down at her wrists, noting the raw, bleeding skin, his jaw tightening just a fraction of an inch. Then he reached down. His hands, rough and calloused from years of surviving the wild, grasped her upper arms. The grip was startlingly firm, yet surprisingly careful not to squeeze her bruises. Before Bee could process what was happening, he lifted her effortlessly off her feet, setting her down on the solid ground beside the block. Shouting, "Hey!" Elias shouted, finally finding his nerve as the mountain man turned his back on him. "I didn't agree to sell her to you. I don't even know who you are." The man stopped. He slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes locking onto Elias. Quietly, "I'm Cullen Vance," he said quietly. A ripple of nervous whispers ran through the crowd. Bee had heard the name in whispers around town, the wild fur trader from the top of Pine Ridge. The man who came down from the mountains only twice a year, who lived alone where the winter killed most men, and who was rumored to be more beast than human. "The gold is there," Cullen said, his voice carrying the weight of a final warning. "Count it, keep it, but if I ever see you looking for her again, I won't pay you with dust." Pause. He didn't wait for a response. He turned to Bee. She stood trembling in the freezing mud, her bare arms covered in goosebumps, clutching the torn shoulder of her dress. Without a word, Cullen unbuttoned his massive buckskin jacket, slipped it off his shoulders, and wrapped it around her. The coat was enormous, drowning her small frame, but it was incredibly warm. It smelled intensely of the deep woods and safety. "Walk," he murmured, a single command meant only for her. Pause. Bee didn't hesitate. Fear of the known was worse than fear of the unknown. She gathered the heavy folds of the jacket and hurried after his long strides, leaving Elias, Silas, and the stunned town behind. He led her to the edge of town, where a massive black draft horse stood tied to a post, loaded with winter supplies. Cullen untied the reins, grasped Bee by the waist, and lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she were a child. He climbed up behind her, taking the reins, his large frame shielding her completely from the biting wind at her back. As the horse began to move, heading straight toward the towering, snow-capped peaks of Pine Ridge, Bee looked down at her raw wrists, protruding from the oversized sleeves of the buckskin coat. The gold dust, the sliced rope, the silence. She had just escaped the devil she knew. But as the town disappeared behind the tree line and the sky turned a bruised, stormy purple, she pressed a trembling hand over her silver locket. She had asked for nothing but to survive the day. Now she was riding into the frozen wilderness with a man they called a beast, entirely at his mercy. The ascent up Pine Ridge was not a trail. It was a punishment. As the massive draft horse carried them higher, the town of Harland Ridge disappeared beneath a thick blanket of gray clouds. The air grew thinner, sharper, carrying the distinct metallic bite of approaching snow. The wind howled through the narrow mountain passes, tearing at the pine trees and whipping freezing sleet against the rocks. Bee sat rigid in the saddle in front of Cullen. Her body was a knot of pure tension. She was terrified of the sheer drops just inches from the horse's hooves, but she was more terrified of the man sitting behind her. She kept herself pulled tight, her shoulders hunched, trying desperately not to lean her weight against his broad chest. Every time the horse lurched over a loose stone and her back brushed against him, she held her breath, waiting for a reprimand, a curse, or the heavy strike of a hand. That was how Elias had treated her. That was how the world had treated her since her husband died. But the strike never came. Cullen Vance rode in absolute silence. He did not force her to lean back. He did not wrap his arms around her waist, choosing instead to hold the reins high and wide, essentially caging her in safety without actually touching her. He absorbed the brunt of the freezing wind, his massive frame acting as a physical shield between her and the storm. Yet the cold was relentless. It seeped through the mud-caked hem of her torn morning dress, chilling her legs until she couldn't feel her toes. The buckskin jacket he had given her was incredibly warm, but her exhaustion was catching up to her. The adrenaline that had kept her standing on that auction block was completely burned out. Her stomach cramped with violent hunger. Elias had not fed her in 2 days to ensure she looked meek for the buyers. A violent shiver racked Bee's frame. Her head drooped forward, her chin hitting her chest. For a terrifying second, the world spun into a blur of gray stone and white snow. Her grip on the saddle horn loosened. She swayed dangerously to the right, slipping toward the steep drop-off of the ravine. Before she could fall, a heavily gloved hand clamped onto her left shoulder, snapping her back to the center of the saddle. The grip was iron hard, stabilizing her instantly. "Whoa," Cullen commanded, his deep voice startlingly loud against the howling wind. The heavy draft horse stopped immediately. Cullen didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask anything. He swung down from his saddle with the agility of a mountain cat, his boots crunching loudly in the fresh snow. He walked to her side, reached up and gripped her waist. Bee gasped, her hands flying up to push him away in a blind panic. "No! I can keep riding. I promise. I won't fall again." "Quiet," he said. The word wasn't a threat. It was an instruction. He lifted her down. The moment Bee's feet hit the frozen ground, her legs buckled. She would have collapsed into the mud and snow, but Cullen caught her by the elbows, holding her upright until she found her balance. He didn't linger. As soon as she was steady, he let go and turned to lead the horse off the main trail. Bee stood shivering, pulling the oversized buckskin jacket tighter around her chest. She looked around. They were standing before a shallow overhang of black rock, slightly sheltered from the biting wind by a dense cluster of ancient pines. It wasn't a cabin, but it was out of the storm. "Sit." Cullen pointed to a flat, dry rock near the back of the overhang. Bee obeyed immediately, curling her legs under her, trying to make herself as small as possible. She watched him with wide, wary eyes as he moved. He was efficient, entirely in his element. He unsaddled the horse, wiped it down with a dry cloth, and gave it a handful of oats from a canvas sack. Then he moved to the center of the overhang. From a dry crevice in the stone, he pulled out a hidden stash of kindling and split wood. Clearly, this was a waypoint he used often. Within minutes, a fire was crackling to life. The sudden burst of light and heat felt like a physical blow. Bee stared at the flames, her body trembling violently as the warmth began to thaw her frozen limbs. Cullen filled a small tin pot with snow and set it on a flat stone near the edge of the fire. Then he sat across from her, his long legs stretched out, his pale blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. He watched her, not with the hungry, consuming gaze of the men in the saloon yard, but with the quiet, assessing look of a man trying to determine how badly a trapped animal was injured. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Bee couldn't bear it anymore. Her fingers nervously traced the outline of the silver locket hidden beneath her dress. "What?" Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard, her throat raw. "What are you going to do with me?" Cullen blinked slowly. "What do you mean?" "You bought me," she whispered, the shame making her stomach twist. "You paid Elias a fortune in gold. You bought me like property. So what is the work? What do you expect me to do?" He didn't answer immediately. He reached out, using a thick stick to shift a burning log, sending a shower of orange sparks into the dark. "I didn't buy you," he said, his voice flat and calm. Bee let out a bitter, shaky breath. "I saw the gold. The whole town saw it. I paid a debt to stop a crowd of cowards from treating a woman like a slaughtered calf," Cullen said. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "You aren't property. Not here. Not anywhere on this mountain." Bee stared at him. Her mind, battered by weeks of cruelty, struggled to process the words. Men did not give away $300 in gold for nothing. There was always a price. She just hadn't figured out what his was yet. The water in the tin pot began to boil. Cullen used a piece of leather to lift it from the fire. He poured the hot water into a chipped tin cup, reached into his saddlebag, and broke off a hard piece of travel bread, dropping it into the cup to soften. He stood up, crossed the small space, and crouched in front of her. He held out the cup. Bee shrank back instinctively, her shoulders hitting the cold rock wall behind her. She looked at the cup, then at his rough, scarred hands. "Drink," he said softly. "It'll stop the shaking." Slowly, with trembling fingers, Bee reached out and took the cup. The heat radiating through the tin was absolute agony on her frozen hands, but it was the best thing she had ever felt. She brought it to her lips and drank. The water was hot and tasted of wood smoke, and the softened bread was the best meal she had eaten in days. As she drank, Cullen didn't move away. He stayed crouched in front of her. His eyes dropped up to her hands, gripping the cup. The heavy sleeves of the buckskin coat had slipped back, revealing her wrists. They were a mess of raw, torn skin and dried blood from the rough hemp rope. Without a word, Cullen reached into his coat and pulled out a small, clean strip of white cotton and a small tin of pine salve. Bee stiffened, her breath catching. "Please, it's fine. It doesn't hurt." "Hold still," he murmured. He didn't ask for permission, but his touch was incredibly careful. His large fingers, calloused and rough as tree bark, took her wrist gently. Bee squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the sting, bracing for the heavy-handed cruelty she had come to expect from men. But his touch was steady and light. He rubbed the cooling pine salve into the torn skin, the pine scent sharp and clean, instantly dulling the burning pain. He wrapped the cotton strip around the wound, tying it off with practiced ease. He did the same to the other wrist. He didn't linger. He didn't stroke her hand or say a word of comfort. When he was done, he simply stepped back and returned to his side of the fire. Bee looked down at her bandaged wrists, clean and protected. A strange, tight feeling formed in her throat. She pulled her knees to her chest, hiding her face in the oversized collar of his coat, and finally let herself cry. She didn't sob out loud. She just let the tears fall, hot and silent, releasing weeks of terror into the dark fabric of a stranger's jacket. Cullen let her cry. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't tell her to be quiet. He just kept the fire burning. Eventually, the exhaustion pulled Bee under. She slumped sideways against the rock, wrapped in the heavy buckskin, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the fire had burned down to glowing red embers. The wind outside was still howling, driving a heavy sheet of snow across the mountain pass. Bea shifted, feeling a strange absence of cold. She blinked her eyes open, adjusting to the dim light. Cullen was not sleeping. He was sitting at the very edge of the overhang, right where the snow met the stone. The wind was whipping his shaggy hair around his face, but he wasn't moving. He sat perfectly still, his back straight, staring down the dark, treacherous trail they had just climbed. A heavy Winchester rifle lay across his knees. Bea watched him for a long moment, the realization settling like ice in her veins. He wasn't just keeping watch against wild animals. He was looking for men. Elias Lowe was a greedy man, and Silas, the saloon owner, had lost his prize. $300 in gold was enough to make desperate men do foolish things. The mountain man had brought her out of the mud, but the harsh land had not yet decided if they would survive the night. The storm broke just after dawn, leaving behind a world buried in blinding white. A draft horse waded chest deep through the fresh powder, its massive breath pluming in the freezing air. Bea was exhausted beyond measure, drifting in and out of a numb stupor, kept upright only by the steady, unyielding presence of the man sitting behind her. When they finally cleared the tree line, the Pine Ridge Plateau opened up before them. The cabin was enormous. It was built of massive, unpeeled pine logs, expertly notched and chinked with hardened clay. A heavy stone chimney rose from the far side, already puffing a thin, welcoming trail of gray smoke into the pale morning sky. It looked less like a simple dwelling and more like a fortress, built to withstand the end of the world. Cullen halted the horse near the front porch. He dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow, and reached up to help Bea down. Her legs were completely useless. As her boots touched the ground, her knees buckled. Cullen didn't let her fall. He caught her by the waist, effortlessly lifting her and carrying her up the wooden steps to the heavy oak door. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. The contrast was immediate and overwhelming. Down in Harland Ridge, everything had been wet, muddy, and smelling of stale beer and unwashed bodies. Here, the air was dry, crisp, and smelled heavily of split pine, dried sage, and clean wood smoke. The interior was a single, cavernous room. The floor was covered in thick, luxurious bear and sheepskin rugs. A massive stone hearth dominated the right wall, with a heavy rocking chair positioned perfectly to catch the heat. Cullen set her down gently in the rocking chair. He walked to the door, pushed it shut against the wind, and dropped a thick wooden bar into the iron brackets with a heavy, final thud. Bea flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. The sound of the lock dropping was a trigger. For months, the sound of a locking door had meant Elias was coming in to scream at her, to withhold food or to threaten her. She was entirely alone in a locked cabin with a man the town called a beast. A man who had just paid $300 in gold for her life. She clutched the oversized buckskin jacket tighter around her chest, her wide, terrified eyes tracking his every movement. She prepared herself for the inevitable. She waited for him to demand his worth. Cullen ignored her panic. He didn't look at her with hunger or expectation. Instead, he moved methodically around the cabin. He threw 3 heavy logs onto the dying embers in the hearth, stoking them until a roaring fire leaped up, bathing the room in a warm orange glow. Then he walked to the far corner and dragged out a large, hammered copper tub. He positioned it a few feet from the fire. Taking 2 large iron buckets, he stepped out the back door, returning moments later with them packed full of clean snow. He dumped the snow into the tub, then took a heavy iron kettle from the stove, which had been keeping water hot, and poured it over the snow. Steam immediately billowed into the cold cabin air. He repeated this process until the tub was halfway full of steaming water. He walked to a heavy wooden chest, opened it, and pulled out a clean, thick white towel and a large, worn red flannel shirt. He draped them over a chair near the tub. Finally, he placed a block of lye soap on the rim. He turned to look at her. Bea was trembling, her hands gripping the armrests of the rocking chair so tightly her knuckles were white. "Wash," Cullen said, his voice a low rumble. "The mud will freeze to your skin, and the cold will sink into your bones if you don't get that wet dress off." Bea stared at him, paralyzed by a mixture of freezing cold and pure fear. I don't. "I have to see to the horse," Cullen said smoothly, cutting off her stammering panic. "And the traps on the south ridge. It will take me an hour." He didn't wait for her to understand. $300 in gold wouldn't stop a man who stood to lose $30,000 to the railroad. Bea looked across the room at the massive silhouette of the mountain man sleeping on the floor. Cullen Vance thought he had paid a debt to save a helpless woman from a cruel crowd. He didn't know he had just brought a fortune and a target directly into his home. 3 days passed on the snow-buried plateau of Pine Ridge. 3 days of an imposing, heavy silence that slowly transformed from terrifying into something entirely different. Peace. In Harland Ridge, silence had always been a weapon. When Elias Lowe was silent, it meant he was calculating a new cruelty. When the town was silent, it meant they were turning a blind eye. But Cullen Vance's silence was not a weapon. It was just the natural state of a man who had spent a decade listening to the wind and the wolves rather than the lies of other men. Bea's wrists began to heal, the angry raw flesh turning a dull, healthy pink under the constant application of Cullen's pine salve. She had taken to belting the oversized red flannel shirt around her waist with a strip of soft leather she found in a trunk. She didn't stay idle. Idleness bred panic, and she was desperate to prove her worth, terrified that if she became a burden, the mountain man would realize his $300 in gold had been a waste. She swept the wide plank floors. She learned the temperamental draft of the heavy cast-iron stove. She found a sack of flour, salt, and wild yeast in the dry pantry, and she set to work. When Cullen returned on the 3rd evening, the sun dipping below the jagged peaks and painting the cabin in deep purple shadows, he stopped dead in the open doorway. Snow dusted his broad shoulders and the fringe of his buckskin jacket. His glacial blue eyes swept the room. The cabin was warm, the fire roaring, but it was the smell that had frozen him in place, the rich, heavy scent of fresh, hot bread and roasting venison. Bee stood near the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand, her dark hair pulled back from her face. She braced herself instinctively, her shoulders tightening. She waited for him to demand his meal, to criticize the way she had used his supplies, to remind her of her place. Cullen did none of those things. He closed the heavy oak door, dropping the wooden bar into place with its familiar thud. He shrugged off his jacket, hung it on the iron hook, and walked to the wash basin. He scrubbed his hands and face in silence, then walked to the massive wooden table. He sat down. He didn't speak. He just looked at the loaf of bread, then up at her. Slowly, Bee brought the cast-iron pot to the table and ladled the thick stew into 2 wooden bowls. She set one in front of him, then placed the bread and a hunting knife between them. She sat across from him, keeping her eyes cast downward, her hands folded in her lap. Cullen picked up the knife. He sliced 2 thick pieces of bread. He placed the first, the larger and warmer center cut, onto the wooden board in front of her. Then he took the edge piece for himself. It was a microscopic gesture, a single slice of bread. But to a woman who had spent months fighting for the scraps Elias left behind, who had been starved to make her look meek for an auction block, it was monumental. Bee stared at the bread, the tight knot in her throat making it impossible to swallow for a long moment. "Eat," Cullen murmured, his voice a low, rough rumble. "You're still too thin for this altitude." She picked up the bread, and they ate in companionable silence. It was the first time Bee tasted her own food without the bitter seasoning of fear. After dinner, Cullen took to cleaning his Winchester rifle near the fire, the rhythmic click of the lever action becoming a steady background noise. Bee sat in the rocking chair, a needle and heavy cotton thread in her hands. She had found a tear in the shoulder of Cullen's heavy canvas work shirt, and had quietly taken it upon herself to mend it. She finished the knot, biting the thread loose. As she shifted to fold the shirt, the tarnished silver locket swung forward from her collar. It caught on the heavy wooden armrest of the rocker. The tiny, fragile clasp, already weakened from when she had pried the back open, snapped. The locket hit the floorboards. It popped open, and the tightly folded, wax-sealed paper spilled out, fluttering to the edge of the bearskin rug, right at Cullen's boots. The rhythmic clicking of the rifle stopped. Bee's blood ran cold. She lunged forward, dropping the mended shirt, her hands scrambling over the rug. But she was too slow. Cullen's large, calloused hand reached down and picked up the translucent paper. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at her. Her face was chalk white, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. She looked exactly as she had on the auction block, like a trapped animal waiting for the axe to fall. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her voice shaking violently. "Please, give it back. It's nothing. It's just—" Cullen looked down at the paper. The wax seal was broken, the legal print visible through the thin parchment. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the elegant script. TH. The silence in the cabin stretched, pulling tighter and tighter, until Bee felt she might shatter. "Riverbend," Cullen read aloud, his voice flat, devoid of any inflection. 300 acres, prime water access. He looked up, his pale blue eyes pinning her to the chair. "This is a deed of ownership, in your name, Beatrice Lowe." Bee swallowed hard, pressing her trembling hands against her thighs. My husband transferred it to me before the fever took him.
Thank you.
He knew his brother had gambling debts. He wanted me to be safe. Cullen stared at her, the pieces clicking together behind his watchful eyes. Elias Lowe didn't sell you to Silas, the saloon owner, to pay for a burial. No, Bee whispered, the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilling over her lashes. Elias owes $30,000 to the railroad men in Denver. He needs the Riverbend land to clear it, but he can't sell it without my signature. If he sold me to Silas, if Silas forced me into marriage or broke me down into servitude, Silas would control your assets, Cullen finished, his voice dropping an octave, a dangerous edge creeping into the rough timbre of his tone. He and Elias would split the profit from the land. Bee nodded, wrapping her arms around her stomach. I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door, I swear it. When you bought me, I thought I could just work off the debt you paid and then disappear before Elias realized I had taken the original deed from the safe. But he knows by now. He knows I have it. She looked at him, her chest heaving. $300 in gold won't stop him. Not when Riverbend is worth a fortune. He'll come for me. I'm a target, and I've made you one too. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to stand up, to shout, to throw her out into the snow for deceiving him. She had brought a deadly threat into the only sanctuary this man had. Cullen slowly folded the deed along its original creases. He reached forward and placed it gently into her trembling hand. It's my door, he said. Bee blinked. What? I said, it's my door, Cullen repeated, his gaze entirely steady. I decide who stands behind it, and I decide who breaks against it. He didn't yell. He didn't ask her to leave. He just looked at her with that same unmovable certainty that had shielded her from the wind on the mountain pass. He didn't see her as a liability. He saw her as a woman who had fought like hell to keep what was hers, and he respected it. Bee stared at him, the profound weight of his protection washing over her, loosening a knot in her soul she hadn't realized she was carrying. She opened her mouth to thank him, to say something, anything, but the words died in her throat. From the dark, freezing expanse of the mountain pass outside, cutting through the howl of the wind and the thick timber walls of the cabin, came a sound that made the blood freeze in Bee's veins. It was the deep, rhythmic, echoing bay of hunting hounds. Cullen's head snapped toward the heavy oak door. The peaceful silence of the cabin was gone, shattered by the violent reality of the world below. Elias Lowe hadn't just realized the deed was missing. He had hired men who knew how to track in the snow. The hounds howled again, closer this time. They had found the trail up Pine Ridge. The harsh land had not kept them away, and the storm was no longer enough to hide her. The deep, guttural baying of the hounds echoed off the sheer rock faces of Pine Ridge, slicing through the howl of the winter wind. It was a sound designed to strike primal fear into the hearts of hunted things, and for a fraction of a second, Bee felt her knees threaten to give out. Cullen did not hesitate. The quiet, domestic calm of the cabin vanished instantly, replaced by the lethal, focused energy of a predator defending its territory. He moved with frightening speed, snuffing out the 2 oil lanterns on the table with swift swipes of his hand, plunging the cabin into the dim, flickering shadows of the hearth fire. "They tracked the horse," Cullen said, his voice stripped of any warmth, hard and flat as iron. The snow didn't cover the trail fast enough. He strode to the corner of the room, grabbing a heavy canvas ammunition belt and slinging it over his broad shoulder holder. He checked the action of his Winchester rifle, the metallic clack-clack sounding deafeningly loud in the tense air. He pulled his heavy buckskin jacket from the hook, shrugging it on, his pale blue eyes already fixed on the heavy oak door. "Cullen," Bee whispered, her voice trembling. "There are too many of them. If Elias brought Silas and hired trackers—" "They don't know the mountain," Cullen said, not looking at her as he stuffed a handful of extra shells into his coat pocket. "I do." He walked to the door, resting his hand on the heavy iron latch. He turned to look at her, his expression entirely serious. "I am going down to the Narrows. It's a choke point on the trail about a half-mile below. They have to pass through it single file. I can turn them back there." He pointed a calloused finger at the wooden bar resting against the wall. "When I step out, drop the bar. You do not lift it. You do not open this door for any voice but mine. Do you understand?" Bee looked at his towering silhouette, at the Winchester gripped in his massive hand, at the man who was walking out into a freezing blizzard to fight a war that wasn't his. She swallowed the hard knot of terror in her throat and nodded. "I understand." Cullen held her gaze for 1 second longer, reading the sincerity in her eyes, then slipped out the door. The wind howled into the cabin for a brief moment before the heavy oak slammed shut. Beeroo shed forward. With trembling, healing hands, she lifted the thick wooden beam and dropped it into the iron brackets with a solid, definitive thud. Then there was only silence, broken by the crackle of the fire and the distant fading bay of the dogs. Bee stood in the center of the room, her breathing shallow and fast. She looked at the fire. She looked at the empty rocking chair. She looked at the wooden table. There, sitting perfectly in the center of the table where Cullen had been cleaning his rifle, was a square cardboard box of Winchester .44-40 cartridges. In the sudden darkness and his haste, he had grabbed a handful, but left the main reserve behind. Bee stared at the box. Cullen was walking down a treacherous mountain path in the middle of the night to face an unknown number of armed men, and he was short on ammunition. If he ran out of shells, Elias would kill him. Silas would kill him. And then they would come up to the cabin, and a wooden bar wouldn't stop them from burning it to the ground with her inside. Beatrice Lowe had spent years making her feel helpless, training her to cower in a corner and wait for her punishment. He had sold her like a piece of meat because he believed she was too weak to fight back. Bee's jaw tightened. The fear in her chest didn't vanish, but it hardened into something sharp and brilliant. She was not a piece of property, and she was not going to wait in the dark for men to decide her fate. She moved quickly. She pulled off the oversized flannel shirt and dressed in a thick wool sweater and heavy canvas trousers she found in Cullen's trunk, rolling the cuffs up so she wouldn't trip. She pulled on a pair of thick wool socks and laced up his spare pair of winter boots. They were far too large, but she stuffed the toes with dry rags until they fit snugly enough to walk. Finally, she threw a heavy, dark gray wool blanket coat over her shoulders, grabbed the box of Winchester shells, and shoved them deep into her pocket. She lifted the wooden bar, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. The snow was falling heavily, but the clouds had broken just enough to let the pale moonlight cast a ghostly glow over the mountain. Cullen's deep footprints were clear in the fresh snow, leading away from the cabin and down the steep, treacherous ridge. Bee followed them. She kept her head down, leaning into the wind, forcing her legs to push through the knee-deep drifts. The cold bit into her face, but she focused entirely on the deep tracks, placing her oversized boots exactly where his had been. She hiked for what felt like hours, though it could only have been 20 minutes, her lungs burning in the thin altitude. The sound of the hounds was growing louder, no longer an echo, but a direct, visceral threat ahead of her. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked through the night, echoing off the canyon walls with a deafening roar. Bee threw herself flat against the snowy embankment, her heart hammering against the icy rock. She crawled forward on her hands and knees until she reached the edge of a rocky overhang. She peered over the ledge. 50 feet below her was the Narrows, a perilous yard-wide stretch of trail bordered by a sheer cliff wall on one side and a deadly drop into a black ravine on the other. A group of men was clustered at the start of the narrow path. 2 hired trackers were struggling to hold back a pair of frantic, thrashing bloodhounds. Behind them, holding a flickering oil lantern, was Silas, and behind him, gripping a revolver and shouting into the wind, was Beatrice Lowe. But it was what lay ahead of them that made Bee's breath catch. Cullen Vance stood at the far end of the Narrows. He wasn't hiding behind a rock or taking cover. He was standing dead center on the narrow trail, a towering, unmovable shadow against the snow, his Winchester leveled directly at the men below. "That was a warning," Cullen's voice boomed down the pass, carrying effortlessly over the wind. It was the voice of a man who commanded the mountain, completely devoid of fear. "The next one takes the dog. The one after that takes the man holding the lantern." The lead tracker froze, his hand tightening on the hound's leashes. "He's got the high ground, Lowe," the man shouted back over his shoulder. "Delder, I ain't getting paid to catch a bullet on a ledge." "Shoot him!" Elias screamed, his face contorted in a mask of panic and rage. "There are 5 of us and 1 of him. Shoot him and get the girl." "You're standing on an ice shelf," Cullen called out, his voice deathly calm. "The trail here is mostly packed snow over empty air. You fire a volley, the sound and the impact will drop the whole ledge into the ravine. You won't even have time to scream." Silas raised his lantern, peering at the cracked edge of the trail near his boots. The saloon owner was a cruel man, but he wasn't a foolish one. He lowered his gun. "He's right, Elias. The ground is hollow. We try to rush him, we all go down." "I don't care," Elias roared, stepping forward, his eyes wild with the desperation of a man who knew he was a dead man if he didn't get the deed. The railroad men in Denver were far less forgiving than the mountain man. "I need my property. I need what's mine." "She is not your property," Cullen said, the quiet menace in his tone sending a shiver down Bee's spine, even from 50 feet above. "Turn around, Elias. Walk back to Harland Ridge. If you take one more step on my mountain, I will leave you for the wolves." The trackers were already backing up, pulling the hounds with them. Silas shook his head, turning his horse around on the wider section of the trail. "I'm out, Lowe. A woman ain't worth a grave in the ice." Elias was left standing near the edge of the Narrows, his chest heaving, his revolver shaking in his hand. He had lost. He had lost his leverage, his money, and his life. He looked at Cullen, his face twisting into an ugly, hateful snarl. But as Elias shifted his weight, his eyes darted upward, catching a movement on the ridge above the trail. Bee had leaned too far over the edge. A small clump of snow broke loose under her hand, tumbling down the cliff face and landing near Elias's boots. Elias looked up. In the pale moonlight, he saw the dark shape of the wool coat and the pale oval of her face peering over the rock. "Bee!" Elias shrieked, the sound a mixture of triumph and pure malice. He didn't aim at Cullen, knowing he couldn't win the standoff, knowing his life was forfeit to the Denver debt collectors. His greed morphed instantly into spiteful vengeance. If he couldn't have the Riverbend land, no one would. Elias raised his revolver, aiming straight up the cliff face, directly at Bee's chest. "No!" Cullen roared, the absolute calm shattering instantly. Bee froze, staring down the dark barrel of the gun, her hand instinctively clutching the heavy box of shells in her pocket. There was no cover. There was nowhere to hide. Elias pulled back the hammer. Cullen had less than a second. He couldn't shoot Elias. The angle was wrong, and Elias was shielded by the rock overhang below Bee. There was no time to run, no time to shout. There was only the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of survival on the mountain. The mountain did not forgive mistakes, and Cullen Vance did not make them. Elias Lowe's finger tightened on the trigger, his face twisted in a mask of desperate malice. But in the fraction of a second before the hammer fell, Cullen didn't aim at the man. He aimed at the ground Elias was standing on. The Winchester roared, a deafening crack of thunder that shattered the icy stillness of the pass. Cullen fired not once, but 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy .44-40 slugs smashing directly into the hollow, fractured ice shelf supporting Elias's weight. Elias flinched at the noise, his revolver firing wildly into the dark sky as the impact of the heavy rifle rounds shattered the structural integrity of the frozen ledge. A sound like a breaking spine echoed through the narrows. A massive fissure zigzagged through the packed snow right between Elias's boots. Elias looked down, his eyes wide, the triumph on his face instantly dissolving into pure, unadulterated horror. "No!" The word was swallowed by the roar of collapsing ice. The entire section of the trail simply gave way. Elias dropped into the black void of the ravine, taking tons of snow, rock, and his insurmountable debts with him. The heavy thud of the avalanche echoing far below was the only grave marker he would ever get. Silence slammed back down onto the mountain, thick and ringing. At the far end of the trail, the hired trackers and Silas had already spurred their horses into a panicked retreat, disappearing into the blinding snow, entirely unwilling to face the wrath of the mountain or the man who guarded it. Bee lay flat on the rocky overhang, her heart pounding so hard it bruised her ribs. She couldn't breathe. She stared at the empty space where the ledge had been, the smell of burnt gunpowder hanging sharp and acrid in the freezing air. It was over. The suffocating shadow that had followed her for months. The man who had dragged her into the mud and sold her like an animal was gone. The crunch of heavy boots on the rocks pulled her from her shock. Cullen was scrambling up the sheer embankment with terrifying speed, his rifle slung across his back. He hauled himself over the ledge, his chest heaving, his pale blue eyes wide with an emotion she had never seen on his weathered face. It wasn't anger. It was stark, raw terror. He dropped to his knees in the snow beside her. His massive hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her back from the perilous edge of the cliff, hauling her upright until she was safely against the solid rock wall. "I told you," he breathed, his low voice shaking with an intensity that vibrated through the thick wool of her coat. "I told you to drop the bar. I told you to stay inside." Bee looked up at him. She saw the heavy snow caked in his shaggy hair, the sharp lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and the desperate tightness of his grip. He hadn't been afraid of the men on the trail. He had been terrified of losing her. With a trembling hand, Bee reached deep into the pocket of the oversized coat. She pulled out the heavy, square cardboard box of Winchester shells and pressed it into his broad chest. "You forgot your ammunition," she said, her voice cracking, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. "You walked out to fight 5 men, and you left the box on the table. I wasn't going to sit in a locked room and wait for you to die for me." Cullen stared at the box of shells in her small, freezing hands.